Hey guys, today I wanted to go over 5 of my absolute most important Barbarian specific tips that are really going to help you take your Barbarian to the next level. Hopefully, this guide helps and you guys learned something new from this. Let me know in the comments below if you did. So, first and foremost, let's start with resource aspects. In particular, a lot of you are probably running triple shouts, right? Rallying cry, war cry, and challenging shout. And you're looking for the bold chieftain's resource aspect, which reduces the cooldown of your shouts by up to 6 seconds. And also this one, the resource aspect of Echoing Fury, where your shout skills generate 4 fury per second while active. Both of these are very, very important for building not just Whirlwind Barb, but a lot of different Barbarian builds in general that use triple shouts. So if you're struggling to get those from random drops, the best thing you can do is try to target farm them by heading to the Purveyor of Curiosities and gambling for rings. This is going to really help you get them because resource aspects can only roll on rings. So by gambling a lot for rings, you have a much higher chance. Lately, I've been doing this a lot to get the aspect of giant strides, which I'm going to be using for my jump barbarian build that's hopefully coming really soon. So gamble for those rings. Over time, you are going to see a lot more of them. Do your Hell Tides, do the side events when you see them, and try to farm some obols. My second tip, and probably one of the most important things if you're trying to make a build, is going to be put 1 point in Hamstring. Your bleeding affects slow enemies by 10%. And just 1 point here is enough because if you have some consistent way of applying bleed through your builds, which is actually really easy to do, we have a couple of options. So for example, Furious Whirlwind, 40% of your base damage of Whirlwind is applied as a bleed, or sorry, on top of that is applied as a bleed. Anything like Rend will apply a bleed, or Flay will apply a bleed. You can also, if you have very good Berserk uptime, the aspect of Berserk Ripping is another good way to apply bleeds. And also, if you're using a two-hand sword, you'll get the expertise that applies a bleed as well. So if you have some consistent way of getting a bleed, which is not that hard, 1 point of Hamstring will simply make all of your bleeds affect slowed enemies. And what this will do is unlock a world of conditionals for your build that's going to help you do a lot more damage. Damage to slowed, damage to crowd controlled, that's also going to work. Damage to bleeding. There's just a lot of conditionals for the Barbarian, and Hamstring really opens that up by making all enemies crowd controlled so long as they're slowed. I really like using No Mercy, for example, and I get 3 points of this from my necklace. And what this does is gives me 8% increased critical chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. Again, we're getting basically permanent slow on everything we fight. The only exception here is bosses, so just keep that in mind. The slow effect from bleeds won't affect bosses, so if you're struggling with that single target damage, it's something to know. Now, on the subject of expertise, let's talk about that. Barbarians are masters of different weapons. That's why we can carry so many different weapons and use so many different options. But expertise is very good because it's going to allow you to get extra bonuses based on whatever you're using. So, for example, if I'm using a two-handed axe, I will get 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies and 10% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies. Now, this is going to basically affect what kind of weapons you actually want to be using for your build. Expertise is also affected by the level. You are going to have to level up your weapons by using those specific weapons, but it's based off how much damage you do, so it's really easy to get your weapons fully leveled up once you're in the end game. Don't worry about keeping them all up to date. You can see here that for one-handed axes, I have a 0.5% increased crit chance against injured enemies, and this is going to be doubled if I was using 2 axes at the same time. Every rank, this would actually go up, so at rank 2, I would get 1% crit chance. Rank 3, I would have 1.5 crit chance, so on up till 5%. In addition, at level 10, you'll get an additional bonus. So, for example, one-handed axes at level 10, if I'm using an axe, I will have a lucky hit where critical strikes have up to a 55% chance to grant 6% increased attack speed, and this attack speed bonus is actually going to be doubled if I'm dual-wielding axes. Keep in mind that the weapon expertise is only going to be applied to whatever weapon you're currently using. So even if I had one-handed axes equipped, if I was using a two-handed sword, I would be getting this expertise, which applies a bleed, as well as gives you extra bleeding damage after killing an enemy. Now, you do also get one technique slot, and basically, this means that you will get some bonus regardless of what weapon you're using. And you can simply, click it to equip whatever you want. Typically, most barbarians, you're going to want to look at something like the two-handed sword expertise, which is going to give you 20% of your damage inflicted as bleed, which is really good for setting up hamstring or just applying a bleed if you need it. Or two-handed axe expertise, which is going to give you 15% multiplicative damage to vulnerable enemies, which is really good. Vulnerable is kind of the key of most builds. Keep in mind, though, that you only get the top passive. You do not get the bottom passive. So if I had two-handed axe expertise, I am always getting the 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but I am not getting the 10% crit strike chance. And I will get this even if I'm using whatever weapon. Now, speaking of weapons, barbarians have 4 of them. It's important to know how to actually use them, and it's going to help you a lot for itemizing properly if you understand what the different weapons do. First off, all of your abilities will actually choose by default one of these weapons. So over here for Whirlwind, it auto-selects to the Great Sword of Limitless Rage. But I don't want to be using that. I'm running a dual wield where I want to be using my unique sword. So if I use my middle click, I can actually switch to dual wield, and you can see I can also switch to my two-hand mace, my two-hand sword, or go back to the auto-select where the game just tries to pick whatever will do the highest damage. But that's not always the case because it's not going to include things like expertise. So I want to be using my unique sword, which does more damage. That's why I'm going to make sure that I'm set to dual wield. The important thing is that also, if I know that I'm using my dual wield weapons, you're going to want really good DPS on those weapons. However, your other weapons, so for example, this two-handed mace, the item power and the DPS just don't matter as much because I'm not actually using it to deal any damage. Functionally, it just acts like a stat stick. The only thing that matters is the stats that I'm getting from it. So the vulnerable damage, the strength, the all stats, and the crit damage, as well as the legendary aspect, are all helping my build. All of those also affect my dual wield damage. I'm just not getting the damage per second of the mace unless I'm actually using it. This can also be helpful to know if you're running any kind of build that wants to switch weapons constantly. So a lot of different barbarian effects will have, like, if you switch weapons, you deal more damage. So you could, for example, have on my lunging strike, I could have my two-handed sword, and then my whirlwind could be the dual wield swords. That way I'm getting that bonus when I switch from using my lunging strike to my whirlwind. Finally, for your weapons, it's good to know that every single weapon type, so for example, two-handed axes versus two-handed swords, they all have an implicit roll. This means that this comes with the weapon just because it's a mace. So for the two-handed mace, it's 94.5% overpower damage. All maces roll overpower damage. Swords are really good because they run crit damage on them implicitly. Same thing with the two-handed sword, it runs crit damage. So this is really good. Typically, crit damage is going to be the most important one. So if you can, try to run 3 swords. However, if your build dictates running something else, that's totally fine as well. I would just definitely look for swords if you can. Finally, my last tip for Barbarian. If you're getting into harder content, you might start finding yourself dying a lot. It's important to know that if you can't stay alive, well, you're not going to deal any damage. So we have to make sure that if you are struggling, focus on your defense first. And trust me, the damage will come in time, even if it feels a little low right now. The best places that you can get defense are going to be your chest piece. You can see here, I'm rolling maximum life, damage reduction, percentage total armor, and damage reduction while fortified, as well as my pants, where I'm getting damage reduction from distant, percent total armor, and damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding. You can also see here that I'm running the disobedience aspect. This is one of the most important aspects you can run, and if you're struggling to stay alive, I would definitely throw this at least into your build. If not, you might even want to put this into your amulet to get the kind of the multiplier bonus of the amulet. But disobedience is a great aspect. Now, sometimes for your chest and your legs, you might think about running something like the Rage of Harrogath or the Temerity, and while these options are not that bad, keep in mind that their stats are not as defensively focused, meaning that you are giving up a lot of survivability in your 2 most important survivability slots. So if you're struggling to stay alive, you may want to look for a defensive piece instead, and then over time, you'll build that damage. The helmet can also roll max life as well as percentage armor, so keep that in mind. Your amulet can also roll plus ranks to defensive skills, which is going to buff up your challenging shout, which is a damage reduction cooldown, as well as your rallying cry, which is your resource generation and your unstoppable cooldown. So a lot of builds like to run these anyway. So plus ranks to defensive skills really helps those. It will also buff up something like Iron Skin or Ground Stomp if you're using those as well. Over in abilities too, there are a couple defensive options you can try to run. Booming Voice is great just because it's going to increase the duration of your shouts, and it's a very good pick even if you're not struggling with survivability, just for better cooldown. But you can also run Guttural Yell, which is going to reduce the damage of enemies by 12%. And Raid Leader, this is going to heal allies for 3% of their max life per second, and this does stack based on your shouts. So with 3 shouts going, you're getting 9% of your life per second for your entire party. It's a really great talent, and I would definitely try running it if you're struggling to stay alive. It's going to help your healing a lot. So that's it for today. These are just some general tips that I want to throw out that have really helped me build my Barbarian. They're not any like build specific, so even if you're not playing Whirlwind, these are just general things I like to apply when I'm trying to make my build work. Hopefully it helped, and I'll see you guys in the next video.